What are some of the areas of law that are relevant to the construction industry? The purpose of today's video will be to discuss some of these aspects, but I'll also be talking about the legal entities that are present in construction. Of course, in any dispute, you have several parties that are involved, and it's important to identify the legal entities that are present in a dispute. And then I'll also be talking about the risks in construction and how um, the law covers certain aspects, particularly construction law. And then I'll give a very brief overview of um, the various laws that concern the construction industry. So starting off with identifying legal entities. Um, the way we group them usually is as you can see on the slides in front of you. So we have individual legal entities, and these can be, your owner builder, homeowner, for instance. We have incorporated entities, proprietary limited companies, so PTY, LTD companies. A lot of, the trades, talking about residential builders as well, would be classified as PTY, LTD companies. And then you have your publicly listed companies. Examples of such would be Lend Lease. Um, in addition, you have associations, so master builders and owners corporation, they would also be classified as incorporated entities. Now, the government would also be considered as a legal entity, and within the government, there's two classes. So you have your state government and the federal government. Now, when we're talking about state government, we're talking more of, at the local level. Whereas federal, you can have examples such as, the Commonwealth Department. So if you've got, your Treasury, for instance, that would be classified as a legal entity. There's also, Commonwealth agencies. An example would be the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. That would be considered as a Commonwealth agency, um, and would be classified as a legal entity. You have your Commonwealth authorities. So an example of that would be the National Capital Authority that looks after the capital city of Australia, Canberra. And then you have you've got Commonwealth companies such as the NBN. So that's the classification that we adopt when it comes to identifying legal entities. In terms of risks and how some of them are targeted in the law that we have in construction. Four main aspects that I'll be discussing in this video. So the limitation of liability, insurance, payment, and intellectual property. Let's start with limitation of liability. So what does that mean? Limitation of liability basically means it's a provision that you have in a contract that specifies a limit on the amount that one can sue for a breach of contract. So if I had a contract with another party and I breached that contract, they should have a provision in the contract that states a maximum limit above which I cannot exceed the amount that I sue them for. And the way we do it in contract law is that we classify the provision. So when it comes to limitation of liability, they can either be liquidated or non-liquidated damages. So what's the difference? Liquidated damages is where you have an estimate. So you came up with an estimate, and you have the value specified in the contract. So you say if you breach that, if there's a 2-day delay, for each day of delay, you're going to be charging $100,000, for instance. That would be an example of a liquidated damage provision provided in the contract. Non-liquidated damages, they have not been pre-estimated, so there's no estimate. And as such, it will be left to the judge to make such an estimate. So when we're talking about limitation of liability, we're mostly concerned with damages. So part of contract law, where it's the compensation for the innocent party because the guilty party has breached a particular a clause in the contract. We can also have that limitation of liability in tort. So, and in tort, it serves to limit the torturous duties that you owe to others. So it's important to have that covered in your contracts. Insurance is another aspect that is closely examined in contract law and in tort law. Um, specifically public liability insurance, and that is the insurance that protects you as a builder against accidents or damages caused by negligence or unforeseen occurrences. We also have, the payments and how they are scheduled, especially for contractors once they complete work. When do you give them the payment? How much should you be paying them, etc. And that full payment structure should be specified in the contract. Intellectual property as well is a very tricky area, especially when you have BIM. So when you're using building information modeling to deliver uh, digital, representations of a project, we get into the question of who owns the design and the architectural work. That's more of a property law question: who owns the right of that thing, um, or who has an interest in that thing. So it's so you see that when it comes to intellectual property, even though it's an area that is covered by contract law, it also goes into property law, the aspect of who owns the interest of different designs, and we'll have a look at BIM contracts and how to set up BIM contracts later on in the course in a different video. But it's just a very quick summary over here of the areas that are relevant for us in construction. So contract law, we already talked about that. So these are promises and agreements between parties. It's that law that covers these agreements and promises. Tort law addresses civil wrongs, and these are civil wrongs that do not arise out of contractual obligations. So anything that arises out of contractual obligations, any promises that you make to a different party, this would be dealt with in contract law. Tort law only deals with civil wrongs outside of contractual obligations. And then we have the legislation. We talked about statute and how it's important, and how it's basically a mechanism developed in the parliament when they enact certain laws. Now, if you do breach these legislations, you can be liable for a claim, for a civil claim. An example of a legislation that would be relevant to construction would be work health and safety legislations. If you don't follow these regulations, then you might be liable for a civil claim. And then there's, of course, the law of restitution. And this is something that I'll be covering later on when we talk about contract law. And that's basically, it's so its main function is to deprive the defendant, so the guilty party of a gain, rather than compensate the claimant of the loss suffered. So what in basic terms, what you do is, for the guilty party, the court would ask them to give some of the gains, to give up some of these gains, and pass them on to the claimant. And that's the law of restitution. I'll be talking more about that later on in a separate video as well.